What is happening, guys? Cowboy here, and today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at Amara Skill Tree in Borderlands 3. So please excuse my voice, came down with a little bit of a sinus infection traveling back from the trip, but I still want to get this out to you, and today we're going to be taking a look at all three of Amara's skill trees and going in-depth into her action skills and abilities. So Amara in particular has Phase Cast, which is an astral projection we shoot out, Phase Slam, where we leap into the air and slam enemies, and then Phase Grasp, which is our CC option, locking a target down. Now, Phase Cast in particular, we shoot out an astral projection, pretty good base damage at 133, 22-second cooldown. Moving on from there, we have our first upgrade, Fast Hands, and this is just an outright passive, increasing reload speed, weapon swap, and mode switch speed. Moving over from Fast Hands, we have Do Harm, and this is the main mechanic with Astral Projection. So you can see killing an enemy is going to grant us a stack of Rush. For every stack of Rush, the action skill damage is going to get increased. This goes up to 10 stacks, and it's a 20-second rolling duration on it. Moving on from Do Harm, of course, we have another way that we're able to gain Rush stacks, and that is with Violent Tapestry. Applying an elemental effect grants a stack of Rush. Once again, still stacking up to 10 with a 20-second duration, but this allows us to build up those stacks both through elemental effects and through killing targets. Moving down, we have Transcend, giving us increased accuracy and critical hit bonus for a few seconds after we do our skill. So we toss out our skill as a nuke, and then we're going to get that critical hit damage and accuracy bonus, making sure we capitalize on our damage. Restless, which is going to give us increased action skill cooldown rate. And then, of course, Alricity, which is going to give us increased reload speed for every stack of Rush, and after consuming those stacks, this bonus is further amplified for a duration of 8 seconds. Moving on to our first big single point pickup, we have Ascendant. All action skill augments gain increased effects. We're going to be talking about augments later. Those are the abilities that are kind of off to the left and the right, but Soul Sap will get an additional 20% lifesteal, Allure goes up by 100%, Glamour duration goes up by 50%, Bright Star damage is increased by 25%, and Stillness of Mind has additional CC lockdown. Moving on to Lay Bare, pretty straightforward. Enemies take increased damage from all sources after being hit by our action skill. This builds up to 15%, so a nice solid pickup choice there. Moving on into Wrath, we get increased gun damage, and once again, this effect is going to be increased for a bonus after we've activated our skill. So we have 3% going up to a 9% total, or alternatively 15% after activating the skill. Moving on to From Rest, we get improved fire rate as well as charge time, and this is just a baseline passive. It's going to help us no matter what tree we're going down. So always a solid choice to look into picking up. Moving on down into the second to last tier, we get Remnant. Whenever we kill an enemy with a gun or action skill, we get a homing projectile that seeks out, dealing our action skill's elemental damage. And the cool thing about this is the overkill bonus. Any overkill is added to this projectile's damage. So you can obviously see how this gets kind of silly. And then, of course, Awakening, which is going to increase the effectiveness of our rush stacks up to 30%. When we take all that effectiveness, of course, this only synergizes even more with Avatar, which is going to put us up with 10 additional bonus stacks. And then on top of that, we're able to now use our ability twice per cooldown period. When you consider cooldown reduction, you're looking at dropping out your astral projection roughly once every 10 seconds. Now, before we jump straight into augments, I want to briefly discuss this because this is one of the new things with Borderlands 3 that I think is an absolute game changer. For each action skill, we have an element, an augment, and then an outright change to the ability. So with this first case here, Soul Sap is considered an augment. We could pick this up and get damage back based on damage dealt. With something like Deliverance, this is going to replace Astral Projection and basically give us an alternative version of the skill, completely changing how the skill itself will function. And then lastly, we have our action skill element, which you can find these in the various trees, and this is going to dictate the elemental damage we do with our skill. And what's so cool about this, in my opinion, is never before have we seen this level of customization. You essentially have 3 different action skills to choose from for each tree, a variety of elements to pick from, and a passive effect that you can pick up for that particular skill, and it's just fucking awesome. The first one we have up is Soul Sap, a very solid choice here. When you consider the Ascendant bonus, we're getting back 50% of the damage that we deal with our ability as health coming on back. Nice sustain. The alternative, Stillness of Mind, is going to be a lockdown option, allowing us to phase lock enemies that are hit by the ability. If we target an enemy with Phase Grasp, enemies that are hit with Phase Grasp are also locked down. This is going to decrease the damage and increase the cooldown though. As for our first action skill replacement, we have Reverberation, giving us a climbing bonus of 50% damage per enemy hit. So as you can imagine, in big scenarios, this will cause our action skill to just do a ton of damage. And the alternative, which I personally love, Deliverance. Whenever we hit an enemy, we're going to release an elemental projectile from it. 3 projectiles per enemy hit, which are going to seek out and hit other enemies. So two very spicy choices to choose from. Our final passive upgrade is an outright damage choice with Tandava. We just cause an AoE explosion every time we hit an enemy, so if you're not a fan of CC and you're not a fan of sustain through healing, you can of course take Tandava to just further increase the damage you're going to be doing. But moving on into the Phase Slam tree, and this is our in-your-face, close-range, melee, tank-style tree. Phase Slam also happens to be the highest damaging out of her 3 abilities. We're going to jump up into a big air slam, dealing damage and knocking enemies up. Our first upgrade, Personal Space, keeping with that close-range theme, we get bonus damage based on how close we are to our target, so some obvious 33% potential of increased damage, obvious shotgun synergy there. One with Nature, increase both max health and elemental damage resistance to her action skill element, so you're able to personalize this to a particular element. Clarity, giving us constant health regeneration, and this is really, really nice for a tier 1 skill. You can see this being useful across almost any tree, just having, constant passive health regeneration in effect. Definitely something worth at least 1 point, I think, regardless of what playstyle you're going for. Root to Rise, just outright max health increase, going up to 25%. Once again, a nice solid tanky choice. Arms Deal, we deal increased splash damage and take reduced splash damage. Once again, keeping with that theme, being able to do that splash damage when you're surrounded by enemies up in the melee area. Helping Hands, for a few seconds after using our skill, we remain active with the damage reduction we got. And then Find Your Center, increased melee damage. Additionally, for a few seconds after using our skill, we gain increased melee range. So a solid pump to our melee damage, and then 50% additional range after using our skill. I would assume this ends up using the Siren Arms to actually attack enemies, but we didn't have enough points to test it. Mindfulness, whenever we take damage, we gain a stack of Mindfulness. For every stack, we get shield regen delay and movement speed. So just another solid tanky option here. It's just going to, further amplify our ability to survive. Vigor, killing an enemy is going to increase our movement speed, and of course this will stack. Samsara, whenever we deal damage to an enemy with our skill, we gain a stack of Samsara. For every stack, we gain increased gun damage and health regeneration for a few seconds. Stacks decay after a few seconds. You can see 2% per enemy damaged, 1% of max health per stack, goes up to 25 stacks. Once again, with that in-your-face synergy, just building up these stacks and keeping us in the fray. Jab Cross, whenever we deal melee damage to an enemy, we gain increased action skill damage and weapon damage for a few seconds. As you can see, this goes up pretty significantly, up to 55% increased weapon skill damage at max tier. Do Unto Others, whenever an enemy damages Amara, she automatically throws an energy orb back at them, dealing action skill damage. Has a short cooldown, and then Guardian Angel, which is bonkers. Whenever we enter Fight for Our Life, she immediately gains a second wind, restores her health, and creates an action skill Elemental Nova that knocks back nearby enemies on a 60-second internal cooldown, essentially a cheat death mechanic. Our last ability is Blitz, which is a melee override. We perform a short dash, and we deal elemental melee damage. And of course, if Blitz melee attack kills an enemy, the cooldown is immediately reset. But jumping on into the augments, the first one we have up is Blight Tiger. Pretty straightforward. It's going to convert the damage of our skill into corrosive. Nothing more, nothing less. Moving on from there, Relevation. Pretty decent choice here. We're now going to create a Nova when we impact on the ground, dealing additional damage to enemies, but decreasing the skill damage. Moving on into our first action skill replacement, we have Fracture, where instead of jumping up and doing a ground slam, we're instead going to summon a handful of fists that will erupt out of the ground, dealing damage to enemies. Or alternatively, we have Downfall, where we're going to leap into the air, shoot out an elemental beam, and then follow it up with a slam. Pretty spicy ability. And the final passive upgrade we have is Glamour, which once again will benefit from Ascendant. This is going to reduce the damage of the ability and increase the cooldown, but it will confuse enemies, making them attack each other. And of course, this gets a 50% duration bonus from Ascendant, making it a solid CC choice. Moving on into our final tree, we have Phase Grasp. Now this tree is focused around crowd control and elemental effects. Phase Grasp will summon a hand up out of the ground on a 13-second cooldown, does some damage, but more importantly, locks an enemy in place. We also have Steady Hands, giving us increased weapon handling and accuracy, just a solid passive upgrade. Anima, where our elemental effects will deal increased damage over time and have increased duration. On top of that, our action skill elemental effect will deal additional damage as well. And then moving on from Anima, we have Infusion, allowing us to convert a portion of all damage dealt by our weapons into our corresponding action skill element. Moving down, Illuminated Fist, we're going to gain increased melee damage, and our melee damage is converted to the same element as our action skill. Oh, let me just move back there. There we go. Wildfire, whenever we apply an elemental effect to an enemy, it has a chance to spread, going up to 40% with full upgrades. Tempest, we deal increased elemental damage, and shock damage in particular is amplified even further. Dread, our gun damage is increased for a few seconds after an enemy's grasp, and whenever any player kills a grasped enemy, our current weapon gets instantly reloaded. Deep Well, gaining increased magazine size with elemental weapons up to 20%, nice solid 1-point pickup. Catharsis, whenever we trigger an elemental effect on an enemy, when that enemy dies, they explode, dealing our attuned elemental damage along with any other element that is currently inflicted upon the enemy, and of course there is an internal cooldown of 8 seconds. Indiscriminate, our bullets that deal damage have a chance to ricochet and deal increased damage to other nearby enemies. Ricochet chance and damage are increased if the target is still affected by phase grasp or alternatively stillness of mind. So less damage on those ricochets, but it's free damage that's going to be going in. Sustainment, we gain lifesteal whenever we deal elemental damage with a weapon, and then Conflux, whenever we apply an elemental effect, there's also a chance they randomly get electrocuted, burnt, or melt. And lastly, Forceful Expression, we deal bonus elemental damage based on our action skilled element up to 11%. Moving on into our augments, the first up is Soulfire. Pretty straightforward. We just convert our action skill into fire damage. Moving on from there, we have Allure. We're going to create singularities that pull in our enemies, and of course, this is going to benefit from Ascendant, giving us a 100% radius increase. The Eternal Fist. We're going to summon a giant fist that bursts from the ground and locks the target in place. However, whenever the grasp enemy is killed, 3 new targets can be sought out by grasp. Ties that bind, which will summon a giant fist, same as before, except however, enemies near the grasp target are linked and damage is shared between all of them, giving you a solid spread damage option with our ability. And of course, the final change, Fist over Matter. After grasping the targeted enemy, large fists will appear and smash the area, dealing damage to all nearby enemies. So all in all, definitely a fair amount of variation between the Amara playstyles. Now, we don't have a full skill builder available yet, like an online builder we can go through and click the abilities. I'd wanted to do that for this video. I was hoping they would have one out after the event, but they're still building it, I guess. But at least based on what I got to experience with Amara, I definitely think I would end up going for a astral projection style of play. You know, looking at the 3 abilities, Phase Grasp obviously very focused around elemental damage and CC on targets, which I think is going to be very powerful, especially for an initial playthrough. And then of course with Phase Slam, you know, you're in the face doing melee damage, a lot of self-sustain. But the idea of the Phase Blast, the astral projection, you know, just shooting out this AoE. And then I feel that if you were to couple that with things like reverberation and then some of the elemental skills over in the phase grasp tree, I think you could get a very cool, almost mage-centric build where you're going to be blasting enemies and just having these elemental orbs fly all over the place and deal damage.
I like that.
So once we eventually get availability to a skill builder, I do plan on doing another video kind of looking more in depth at what I would consider to be my go-to starter build for when we finally get hands-on with the game at launch. But for now, at least, that's going to wrap things up here. So I do have another video very similar to this I'm going to be doing with Zane. Once again, I'll be going in-depth into the Zane tree, and then I'll include some of the playthrough from the event, just so you can, you know, kind of see what I would consider to be my favorite skills in action. But either way, guys, thanks for coming by. Hope you are enjoying the Borderlands 3 content. Like I said, one more to go. But other than that, I'll catch you all next time.